Hey, what's up everybody, this is Muth24, and today I'm taking a look at the second of the Halo Forerunner novels. This is Halo Primordium. This is similarly written by Greg Bear, who wrote the first novel, and the third one, Silentium, which I'll get to later on. But this is actually a review I meant to do a while back and just kind of forgot to hit it up, and then I just recently finished Silentium, so I figured I'd do these like relatively close to one another. The interesting thing about Primordium is that instead of it being told from the perspective of one character and sort of the input of all these different ones, it's mainly told from the perspective of Chakas, who was a pretty important character in the first novel, became sort of a supporting role later on as Born Stellar, as the Isodidact, and the original Didact, and the Librarian to a lesser extent kind of became the major players in the last days of the Forerunner Empire. And one of the things that happened in Cryptum, the first novel, was that Chakas and a few of the other humans that came on board the ship with Born Stellar and the Didact were sent to one of the Halo rings when the Master Builder kind of split them all up. And so we get to see the Halo ring when it's pretty much brand spanking new, when it's sort of this untouched ring of life, and it's still very similar to how you see them in the games. I forget if they specify which installation number it was, but it's sort of this whole new structure because they're just constructing them for the sake of fighting the Flood at that point. So it's their last-ditch effort to take out the Flood. The rings are all being, kickstarted. The plan that the Librarian had in place is being brought to fruition here. That said, this novel is a little bit slower pacing-wise than the first one was. The first one sort of had this sci-fi epic angle to it, similar to the Halo games and the Star Wars franchise or something like that, where we're going on this bold journey, across the galaxy to see this hyper-advanced society that the Forerunners have created, and seeing it through the perspective of these very primitive humans, which I think makes sense for us as readers, because even though we know bits about the Forerunners throughout the games, and we know a lot more of them now with the fourth game, but up until these books came out, we didn't really have a clear idea of how the Forerunners operated when they were alive. We got ideas through the terminals in Halo 3 and that sort of thing, but this is a direct exposure, or at least the first novel was more so than this, were direct exposures to how the Forerunners behaved and how their culture was, and sort of the, like I mentioned, the last days of the Forerunner Empire before they died out, before they had to activate the Halo rings and wipe the Flood from the galaxy. With this one, it being from a human perspective, it's not necessarily poorly written by any means, but it is a little less interesting, I think, because we don't have that direct dialogue between Chakas and Born Stellar or Chakas and the Didact. That was a great thing about the first novel, was that Chakas and Riser were sort of strangers in a strange land, and Born Stellar was to a little bit of an extent, but he was a Forerunner. He knew about how the Forerunner society operated and all that. For him, it was more taking up the role of becoming another Didact in the wake of the Master Builder, executing this plan to get rid of the Didact and all that. And so it's kind of cool to see, like I mentioned, the Halo ring before the Human Covenant War, before anyone touched it, basically. But that said, it's also kind of familiar territory in that regard, because it reminded me a lot of when Master Chief and the crew of the Pillar of Autumn first landed on Halo, and it's this, alien structure, and it's this whole new vast landscape before them and all that. So, to that end, I wasn't really quite as won over by this book. It's, like I said, still well written. It's slower paced, I think, than the other one. But it's also a quicker read in general, if that makes any sense, because I believe this book is actually shorter than the previous one. I don't remember the page count in Cryptum, but this one is 379. Maybe it is longer. I don't know. It's kind of hard to tell, just like comparing them side by side, because I have the paperback of Cryptum, and this is the hardcover for Primordium. But there is, late in this novel, sort of a connection to the proper Halo series. I mean, more so than the obvious being the Halo rings and what the Forerunners left behind and all that. But we get an introduction to a very important character in the larger Halo games storyline. And there's the cover sleeve. You can see that. Some cool art of the Forerunner ships over the Halo as it's being constructed and all that. I don't know if this was concept art for Halo 4 or just something they made for the novel itself, because I know the cover art on Cryptum was concept art for Halo 4. But anyways, getting back on track, there is a pretty important character that gets sort of brought into the spotlight at the very end of this, and it starts to connect the pieces as to why the Forerunner trilogy of novels is so relevant to the Halo 4 storyline. I think we got a good sense at the end of Cryptum as to why things were so important there. The Erdidac's motives, the Librarian, sort of the schism there, and the building of the Halo rings in preparation for the end of the Forerunner Empire. But here, we have a little bit greater hint of characters from these novels having some direct influence on the course of the Halo games as a whole. So that was really cool. I appreciated that. Like I said, I don't think this one's quite as strong as the other two novels in the series. I certainly enjoyed it. I think it is interesting for something different in terms of the storytelling style, the perspective they're presenting, and the fact that it is a Forerunner novel, I think, lends it to still be one of the better Halo novels out there. I've mentioned Ghosts of Onyx as one of my favorites, and then Cryptum and Silentium as well. But I'd still say that this is probably better than something like Glasslands, or maybe even a little bit better than Contact Harvest. I mean, I enjoyed that, but at the same time it was sort of like, oh, this is, the start of the Human Covenant War, one of the earliest conflicts or whatever. I haven't finished the Recall Protocol yet, so I can't really compare that, but as far as I'm concerned, the best Halo novels as a collection, as ones that connect to each other, are probably the Forerunner novels, and it's because you can jump into them without having a whole lot of knowledge about the Halo series. You're going to appreciate it a lot more if you do play the Halo games, if you have played, at least the core games throughout, and we're building up towards Halo 4 or whatever. But that said, someone who has no familiarity with the Halo games could sit down, read the Forerunner saga, and really enjoy it still, I feel. I think it's one of the most accessible video game tie-in novels that I've come across, at least. So, in that regard, I can recommend it as a science fiction series that maybe not quite as, lengthy or complicated as some other sci-fi epics, but it does harken back to sort of the classic sci-fi Asimov, Bradbury style of, here's this weird fantasy landscape, let's just focus on, very particular things about it and build our story from there. So I definitely appreciated that, combining with the classic Halo vibes and going back in time to, show the Forerunners at their peak. So that's pretty much it for this review, and with that, I will see you guys next time.